Welcome to Empowering Seniors. I'm your host, Katherine Ambrose, and I'm honored to have Amy Cameron O'Rourke. She's an author that wrote a book called The Fragile Years. She's visiting Kansas from Florida, and we're going to do a two-part series on her book and on her wisdom in the aging services industry. This first episode will be on the medical perspective, and the next one on the financial perspective, and you're going to learn so much. Amy, thank you so much for being here on Empowering Seniors.
Thank you for having me.
So I saw your book mentioned on social media, and I thought, well, none of my peers have mentioned this book, but it's intriguing. The title grabbed me in, and I looked it up a few times, and I thought about it, and I thought, well, I'm just going to buy it. Unlike some books, I opened it up and I read the whole thing, and I loved it, and I really appreciate you reaching out to me, telling you how much I enjoyed the book. Tell us a little bit about your background.
So I'm a nursing home administrator by trade. I became a care manager in 1999. So the place that you can go to find a care manager is aginglifecare.org. And we're mostly nurses and social workers, and we consult, guide, educate, train the adult children whose parents are in what I've termed the fragile years.
So what do you mean by the fragile years?
So what I wanted to create when I named the stage was immediate recognition. You hear menopause, you know exactly what it is. You hear midlife crisis, you know what that is. So the fragile years, I know immediately what that is. And what I want other people to know is it's a stage. It begins with a slowing down of activity, lowering of energy. Sometimes it starts with an event, maybe a little car accident, maybe somebody wandered off, maybe somebody had a stroke. And everything that you do with your parents when they're in that stage is different than what you would do if they were early in retirement.
What time period might that represent in someone's life?
So keeping in mind that there's always people outside the bell curve, okay? So most of the time you're in your 80s, 3 to 5 years of fragility, meaning walking slower. It's really hallmarked by the pace in which you move. So I heard a study once, they watched an older adult walk down the hall, and they could tell if it took them a certain length of time that they were within a year of death. So it's kind of a natural slowing down of eating, the time it takes you to put the cup to your mouth. And so that's really the hallmark of that time of life.
And you mentioned 80s, that I know you mentioned while we were visiting that early 80s, that might be still young for people.
Yeah, they say that the people over 65 is the most heterogeneous of any other generation, meaning you can't recognize a 65-year-old always, you can't always recognize a 75-year-old. But you can be a very young 81-year-old. Usually it's, in the 80s for 3 to 5 years. Keeping in mind that people have strokes at 72, people go and they climb a mountain at 91, but most of the time you want to get prepared for in the 80s.
Okay. So you can recognize as a professional the fragile years, and sometimes for kids it's a shock.
Early on in my career, I watched these kids come in, and they said most of the time, I just wasn't expecting this. I'm so shocked. I can't believe this is happening. And in my world, it's very normal. And I could see that I had to get where they are, that it isn't as normal, it isn't as common, it is a shock. People have a fear of death, and it's really painful to watch your parent decline. And so it seemed to me to be kind of normal to maybe put your head in the sand or turn away because it's painful. And pain is hard to face. It ends up being a beautiful thing, but I realized that we needed to educate the children as to this is a normal stage. And if you know all about the stage, you can enjoy that time with your parents.
That's a good point, that you can enjoy that time. Maybe the sooner we can get over the shock, the better, so that we can help more. And same thing with spouses, and spouses will help compensate for each other.
Yeah, and I people say, I don't know how to start the conversation. I don't know, my parents won't talk to me about it. And in the absence of having a big thing to do, like moving your parents into an assisted living or moving them into a smaller, they don't want to start with the little steps. And the little steps are listening to your parents when they talk about their friends. So-and-so got taken to the hospital, maybe so-and-so went into a nursing home, maybe somebody had a hip plate, and really listening carefully to them and then asking open-ended questions. What would you like to see happen? What role do you want me to play in this time of life? How can I best support you? What's the biggest mistake I could make with you, Mom? And start listening to them so that you can begin having that conversation before the crisis hits. Now, sometimes you can't avoid the crisis, it happens, and that's okay. But sometimes if you just kind of connect on that level, and then the other thing I was thinking, if there's emotional baggage that you haven't worked out with your parents, work it out. Not necessarily with them, but get resolution, because more often than not, the children that have the hardest time with their parents in the fragile years are the ones that have not gone over. They didn't get their dad's approval. They didn't get, so get help with that in whatever form is comfortable for you so that you're not bogged down by that when you're trying to take care of your parents.
And so many people have strained relationships or estranged relationships. So how do you see that coming into play sometimes in those last few years or months?
It's a very common thing. It's funny you ask that question, because a lot of times I'm asked, I'm estranged from my father, what should I do? And I have no judgment. Sometimes you stay estranged. Sometimes there's been abuse and there's been like trauma that you can't recover from. So but what I do encourage children to do is make a decision that you're going to either resolve it or not. And then if you go through that process and you've resolved to not be in touch with them, that's fine. But put yourself in a process that you're either going to get resolved or not.
So let's speak to the parents that maybe are feeling sad because they're estranged, or maybe they're angry. What word would you have for them?
The same thing. The same thing. Get quiet with how are you going to feel if you die and you've not reached out to your children. Sometimes you feel okay about it, and that's the way that is. But put yourself in a process, and maybe you start with a note. Maybe a letter's less threatening. Maybe sending word through another relative is sometimes a safe way to go about it. Maybe having a social gathering where your children are part of it, but it's not just one-on-one where you haven't talked for 20 years and now you're sitting there looking at them not knowing what to say. Yeah, and then whatever you need to be at peace when you die is what I would encourage people to do.
I really love your questions, because you can make so much more progress and self-discovery by asking open-ended questions rather than statements. And so maybe it's not so much that you need to know what to say to someone, but how to pull information out of them and just get that flow going a little bit.
That's so
get
well
some
said.
Clues.
Right, get some clues. It's very well said. There's a book called My Mother, Your Mother, and it's written by a geriatrician, Dr. Dennis McCullough, and he talks about the 72-hour visit. So if you live across the country or you're local and you work, be with your parents for 72 hours straight. No phone, no nothing. Just kind of be there with them so that they're used to you being around. And then when there is a crisis, they're not thinking, oh, my daughter's here, I must be dying. Like it doesn't take them by surprise. But getting to know them on their terms, and then it's anxiety-ridden. Like, it's anxiety-ridden for the elder, and it's anxiety-ridden for the children. So just know that, and if you want to go at a pace of 5, try a pace of 2. Slow everything down so that you can just experience them and let information kind of gurgle up and remember it, so that when there is a crisis, you've got that solid in your mind as to what you're going to do with them when there is a crisis.
Adult children usually they're in a different phase of life, and they're fast movers. They want to get things done, they want to get things handled, and so that slowing down is such good advice, because remember the phase of life that your parents are in or that you're in, that when we're older, that we're doing a lot of reflecting and thinking back and trying to have some peace with all of it. And that's a conflict, because we're running at a different pace.
That's intuitive and instinctual, and it's so true. And what I would say to the child who just wants to hurry up and learn a lot and there's things that you can do. You know, if you're going to be in the medical systems, learn how hospitals operate, learn how nursing homes operate, look at the local market, keep yourself busy with kind of getting your education before your parent needs help. And then, don't we all need the message about slowing down? Like,
True.
we all need, you kind of treat it like a little meditation, going at your parents' pace. I remember walks with my dad because they were so slow. And I remember everywhere we went, it's like in my memory forever because I was going at a pace where everything wasn't just a blur.
In your book, you say about 80% of people want to die at home. What is the reality?
The reality is 80% die in the hospital. It is the biggest tragedy, and it's so preventable. And if you're the healthcare decision maker for your parents, learn that our healthcare system in the United States is capitalized. And by that I mean your parent, or you, if you're the elder, you're a revenue source for the hospital or the nursing home. And when you're in your fragile years, usually, not always, less is more. If, for example, they want to do a swallow study on you in the hospital, and you say, well, if I get the swallow study, what's going to be the next step? If it's a feeding tube, you can say, no, I don't want the swallow study because I have no intention on putting in a feeding tube. What I realize with the adult children is they don't know to ask those questions. So in the hospital, you're at risk for having a lot of procedures done for you that actually create more of a decline.
So you have to know, has an aging person or has an adult child helping to guide your aging parents, when to say no.
That's right.
And to be on alert.
That's right. I like to call it professional courage. So you're standing there and a surgeon wants to do surgery on your parent and your heart's beating wild and you're like, no. It takes some guts, and maybe you make a call to a friend who's a nurse, and maybe you call a care manager, maybe you call your sister, and you say, I'm about to have this conversation, just to get the courage up to say, no, I know that the decline is not going to be worth it to my mother. She still wants to eat and watch Judge Judy, so I want to leave her alone.
So what happens when people say no to the doctor or no to the hospital?
Well, what I would want the doctor to say is, I'm honoring your decision and giving them it doesn't happen. And not because doctors are bad people, but they work in a capitalized system and they're responsible for generating revenue for their own salary. So I think it's important to have in your camp, if you will, somebody that you can ask questions that the outcome, they're not invested in the outcome. I use the example of an oncologist. You would never ask the oncologist if you should continue chemotherapy, because that's what they do. And it's the same thing with any other procedure, is ask somebody outside of the system, what are the pros and cons of this procedure? And what do your parents want to continue doing? What's important to them? And usually it's basic things like, I want to continue to walk. I want to continue to use the bathroom. I want to be able to eat my dad was that bloomin' onion at Outback Steakhouse. That's, if I took that away from him, life would not be worth living. And find those things out, but ask the person outside the system what the pros and cons are to a procedure.
Sometimes my experience is, if you tell a doctor no, they might have some relief, like, okay, and do a complete turnaround and say, all right, well, if we're not going to do that, then here's what we can do instead. They know what to do.
Yeah.
If you say no.
Yeah, it's almost like you give them permission to say what they think. I think you're right, and I think you can oftentimes open up a conversation and say to the doctor, I know you might not be getting what you want with doing this procedure, but would you help me go on an alternative course here? And I think it is relieving to some. I've actually seen it in some doctors where they kind of know, he's 92, are we really going to put a pacemaker in a severely demented person? Most of the time, and not always, and I'll talk to the elder who is listening, they're usually more at peace with kind of being done than the children are. And it really helps the kids to hear from their parents that they're really okay with not having anything done. It's okay to let go. It's okay to be in this time of life. And I don't want any procedure to take away from my being able to sit here and hold your hand and listen to music together. I want to be able to connect with you. I don't want to be out in anesthesia land.
And so we're not necessarily saying no to procedures or anything. It's just maybe at a certain point you might want to think, is this really what I want? Not push parents beyond what they want. And that's such a tight rope to be on, because parents sometimes feel a lot of pressure from their children because the children want the parent to keep fighting, or if they think the parent wants to fight, I'm going to keep fighting with them. And what you're talking about in your book is how to have the best quality of life. Tell us a little bit about your perspective on that.
So I see older adults a lot having the value of and gratitude for regular everyday things. That's what drew me into the profession to begin with, is watching older adults get such a kick out of kids doing gymnastics in the reception area of the nursing home, and watching adult, like the gratitude for the little things, and really not needing a whole lot of, they've kind of gotten resolution to the life that they lived on earth. And I don't mean you're ready to die, but you know, that last 5 years or last 3 years, they're more peaceful than not, and clearer about not wanting to die in a hospital. There is a thing called overtreatment, and if any of the audience would want to research it, look at it, it's a real thing. But for an elder, the risk of overtreatment is the harm that it can do. There's a startling statistic about an older adult being in the hospital. 20% of the time they are discharged having lost the ability to walk. And, you know, that's something that I really listen to, and I like to make sure that the children are getting that also. I had a guy that he broke his hip, and he said, if I go in for this hip fracture, am I going to come out with my mind? With that medicine that they put in me, am I going to lose my mind? And I said, you might. You might.
Because anesthesia, as we age, affects us differently. So let's talk about that. Surgeries that might be optional, you have to consider because of the anesthesia.
Absolutely. I have a colleague of mine who's a geriatric psychopharmacologist, and she's researching the effects of anesthesia on dementia. What I can tell you anecdotally, so often they go in for anesthesia and they do not come out the same. They're slower, more confused, there's a fog, they fall because they're imbalanced. So, and it's not been studied. You know, the 80-year-old is, they call it evidence-free, because studies that are done on younger people. So every test and every surgery, everything that's done on an older person, they don't have evidence to say, oh, you're not going to lose your mind because we've done this study. It's just not. So, but anecdotally, and this guy, the hip fracture guy, he decided not to have his hip fixed. He lived his life in a wheelchair, he had his mind, and he lived 4 years after that. So they managed the pain, but his value, and I think that's important for the kids to be listening, his value was, I do not want anything to lose my mind. Period. And so we opted out of the surgery. Well, you should have seen the surgeon's face, because it was shocking. But I felt really grateful to be advocating for him, because I knew clearly that's what he wanted.
And that's what you do, is you advocate for your senior client. The senior is always the client.
Yep.
So what does that mean? Let's say the children call you. The senior's the client. So tell us what that means.
Oh, it gets so complicated and so fun. It's what I love about the work. So the elder is always the client. Always. Children often have different opinions about what the elder needs. And I did a series one time called When Parents Have the Right to Make Bad Decisions. My job is to get clear on what the older adult wants, and then bring the children along and educate them as to what they need to know to get on the same page with their parents. Sometimes it works beautifully. Sometimes the kids just can't get there. Sometimes there's a level of tension that I don't like. But most of the time, the kids are anxious that something's going to happen to mom, and something is going to happen to mom. There are things that happen. They do lose their way. They do fall. They do. But to get help with their own anxiety around watching their parents decline. My dad was like this robust, kind of Midwest farmer-looking guy. and it hurt my heart every time I saw him walk on his walker. It physically caused me pain, and I identify with the kids with that pain. And if you know that it's pain, you can kind of stop being so anxious and know that it's just sad.
So having advocates around that can help you decipher what's really going on and add perspective so you don't stay in a state of shock or surprise or confusion is so important, so you can be a good advocate for your parent when they need you.
Right, and care management, Aging Life Care Management, aginglifecare.org is the website to find somebody. You could spend a couple hours with them and get all the information you need to be able to help your parents navigate the systems, or they can be with you for the duration of your parents' illness. It's like having a CPA do your taxes. Wow, what a relief.
And so if you don't have that type of professional in your area, you might be able to get phone consults, or there might be other professionals that work in other aging services that can provide guidance.
That's right, that's right.
So if you decide dying in the hospital is not the preference, what are the options?
So here's a complicated, hard to say thing. In this country, the way you can absolutely guarantee that you're not going to go back in the hospital is to go on hospice. Hospice sends a message to everybody that you don't want to be hospitalized anymore. It's a sure bet that you're not going to go unless there's some medical reason that you go, but most of the time that sends the message you're not going to go. You can, absence of hospice, if you don't have hospice, you can communicate, you can get a post order, physician order for life-sustaining treatment, but that doesn't guarantee that you're not going to go to the hospital. But you want to be very vigilant on educating all the providers that you don't want that knee-jerk reaction of going to the hospital for anything that remotely resembles a problem.
Because it might just make it worse, or you kind of get stuck there, and it might be harder to get back home.
That's right. It is really a hard to cope with. You're in the ambulance, you get out of the ambulance, you're in the hospital, there are all these people, there are the lights and the movement, and you might see 40 people in a day, all the professions that you don't understand, and you leave and you need a lot of time to recover from that experience. And you might not have the energy to do it well.
And so you can get services in your home that are covered to help with that time of life. And sometimes it's not even indicating that you might die. But just hospice is available. Yeah,
I would call, I'd get a doctor's order for hospice, I'd get hospice in the home, I'd look at home care and see what home care costs, and the biggest mistake is people wait too late. They don't want to get started at all. Get started before you think you need it.
Because you can miss that window of opportunity to have a better experience as a family.
Exactly, and you might prevent a problem. So that little caregiver, make sure you're taking your medicine, make sure that you're eating 3 meals a day, making sure that you're staying well, that prevents a hospitalization or prevents a nursing home admission. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
So as you're preparing for your own fragile years, or you see your parents heading that direction, start doing your homework ahead of time, plan in advance, read some books, talk to some professionals so that things will go better.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Amy, so much. And I just loved your book and appreciate you being here. And thank you for watching Empowering Seniors. I'm Katherine Ambrose, and if you have questions about this topic or any of the topics that we do, you can reach us at empoweringseniors@kpts.org or call us at 316-686-4500. Again, I'm Katherine Ambrose, and until next time, this is Empowering Seniors.